historically underserved communities have been denied of this basic human right. And so we know that these historic injustices make them more invulnerable to environmental change, public health impacts, including the climate crisis, and they need to be centered, and their priorities need to be centered every step of the way as Oregon addresses environmental change and climate change. And so this basically is a promise that our leaders will do so and center these populations as they address the climate crisis. Our next piece of legislation is called Equity in Climate and Land Use. And with that, we can move to the next slide. So this House Bill 2488, Equity in Climate and Land Use, and the purpose of this is really to rectify and address the connections between historic social, public health, environmental, economic inequities, land use, so development, housing, transportation, zoning, and the climate crisis. All of these things are connected, and because of the way we've gone about developing our cities, planning for transportation, they have contributed to these inequities in these underserved populations. And these same inequities make these populations more vulnerable to environmental change, including the climate crisis. So this bill will call on the Department of Land Conservation and Development to amend their statewide land use planning goals to address the climate crisis and environmental change. So the key components of this bill are, one, the goal amendments I mentioned. We call on DLCD to either amend their existing goals or add a goal that will address environmental justice to underserved communities. We call on our leaders and local governments to map environmental justice communities, so identify their spatial boundaries, as well as identify the quantitative and cumulative health risks and other inequities that these environmental justice and communities have been experiencing because of longstanding discrimination, including racial discrimination. We want to establish an environmental justice committee that will advise DLCD in the amending of their goals. And this committee will be comprised of individuals that have values around environmental justice. We also want to establish interim greenhouse gas standards. We know that amending these goals and achieving our climate goals will take a long time. And so these interim standards will act as benchmarks to make sure we are making perceivable progress along the way. These changes will not just apply to DLCD at the state level, but they will also apply to local governments. Our local governments, metropolitan areas will have to bring their comprehensive plans up to compliance with the changes at the state level. And finally, our bill addresses outdated and offensive statutory language, such as the term minority. This is often used as a catch-all term and does not reflect the diverse cultures and populations of Oregon. So we instead replace the term minority with more specific terms that will address the diversity of populations in Oregon. And so that was just an overview of our two bills. And with that, I will pass it along to Senator James Manning. And Senator Manning, I really appreciate you taking the time to join us today and offer a few of your words.
Okay, so I think I just unmuted myself. I appreciate the organizations Beyond Toxic, NAACP, the other co-sponsors for this press release or press conference. And I have to start off that we're at a crossroad of racial inequality and climate crisis. We have now arrived at a monumental moment, because we have failed for years to take action to address the environmental injustice and injustice of pollutions from the extraction and damaging fossil fuel energy systems. As Oregon takes on the monumental challenge of addressing the climate crisis, we need to ensure that we do not repeat and recognize the mistakes that we made in the past, systems that shaped our communities' land use, transportation, and energy productions and consumptions. All communities who have been ignored for far too long by our institutions and policies, especially BIPOC communities and our historically underserved communities, must be meaningfully consulted at every step. This is why I'm thrilled to support two legislative opportunities. I think that it's important that we all get behind legislative concept 2902. At this point, all of the bills, all of the legislative concepts should have had a number that has been assigned to it. So I am unaware of where the number is for this legislative concept. But what it does is it's a joint resolution on environmental justice for Oregon that lays a pathway forward for future policies and practices based on the right to ethically balanced, healthy, and responsible use of land and renewable resources for generations to come. The other, HB 2488, we heard a little bit about that, the Equity and Climate and Land Use Campaign, which aims to pass a bill to establish a strict timelines to enact standards for equitable and inclusive public participation and the adoption of climate mitigation practices in Oregon planning goals. These are really important. I keep going back to some of the experiences that, or stories that I've heard about some of the areas of pollution, especially in BIPOC communities. We're talking about rates of asthma that has exponentially decreased and have hurt these communities, especially when we're talking about young and our seniors. We have an opportunity right now to do something for not this generation, not the next generation, but for 5 generations yet to come. I'm looking forward to working with these concepts and these bills. It will be a great opportunity for all Oregon to get behind and make sure that we understand the failures of the past is no longer acceptable and that we united can make a change and for the betterment to improve the quality of life for generations yet to come. And with that, I thank you for this opportunity, and I will pass it on to back over to Lisa for the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Manning. We appreciate your leadership so much, and you've always been just a shining light for environmental justice. Thank you. And I'm delighted to introduce the chief sponsor of this bill, Representative Karen Power.
Thank you, Lisa. And thanks to everyone at Beyond Toxics. It's always a tremendous pleasure to follow Senator Manning when we are collaborating or getting a chance to work on topics together. And so thank you, Senator Manning, for your leadership. I'm extraordinarily excited about both of these bills. And I know you both will continue to hear about the substance. And so I wanted to touch on why I think they are incredibly important for Oregon to advance right now. By way of introduction, my name is Karen Power. I'm State Representative for House District 41, former chair of our House Energy and the Environment Committee, and now working more broadly in my new assignments on transportation and hopefully some other climate and equity initiatives. As a queer person, when I began to work on environmental issues as a legislator and one of the then youngest legislators, who also had a voice at the table became readily apparent when I was often the youngest person in the room. And there is nothing more symbolic of Oregon and also our barriers to participation and structural obstacles for communities of color and BIPOC communities to participate than our land use system. It is a system we are all proud of. It has done tremendous good in developing how our state has grown geographically and physically. And at the same time, these goals were written 50 years ago by people who had very different life experiences and very different purposes. I believe it's time that we take a fresh look at who they're serving and who they incorporate in decision-making. And it's time for us to really reshape and chart a new, more inclusive path to local land use decision-making and government decision-making and centering environmental justice advisory committees at the highest levels of planning purposes in the state. We are in a moment in history where we have an opportunity in Oregon to fix some of these structural things and undertake this work in a deliberate and meaningful way in the session ahead. And I am extraordinarily excited about the way we would be directing local governments to engage deeply to determine the local needs of their communities, not just the folks who have time to attend late night meetings and have time to attend city council and county commission meetings. We know those folks tend to be retired, disproportionately white. There are language barriers, there are childcare barriers, there are work barriers that make those types of ordinary public citizen participation inaccessible for so many people. And we must dismantle those in the years ahead. And so I am just grateful, truly grateful for the opportunity to collaborate on these two pieces of legislation in the year and years ahead. So thank you.
We appreciate you so much, Representative Power. Thank you so much. And we're just delighted you're a chief sponsor, and we'll be delighted to work together with you and Senator Manning every step of the way. And our other chief sponsor is Representative Ken Helm, so we want to thank him as well, and Senator Michael Dembrow. I'd like to hand this over to Sharon Gary Smith, the president of the Portland NAACP. Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you all for being with us. I am absolutely honored to be included as the president, the new president of the Portland NAACP, for us to be able to sit with in solidarity with those of you who've taken on the serious task and have elevated the whole idea of equity and justice in Oregon's land use, land development, and land decisions. I must give a shout out to the chair of the NAACP Portland Chapter's Environmental Justice and Climate Change Committee, Jay Brandon, for pulling us, for dragging our organization into an alliance with Beyond Toxic and the Eugene Springfield NAACP. We find this suite of environmental legislation well-intentioned, specific, very clear, very focused, and very strategic at this time. And we're proud to be able to come along, not only to join in celebration of sponsorship, but to elevate and educate our members and to cause them to be a part of the great circle of activist warriors who will get behind the sponsors. I thank you, Representative Karen Power, to hear your story and hear your intention, and you, Senator Manning, who it's always a pleasure to see, to be willing to stand in front of what has been put together so powerfully and intentionally. I want you to also know that as an African-American Oregonian, born and reared here in a state that prides itself on its stewardship, on its attention to the land, to the lakes, to the mountains, we know that the inequitable practices and the differences in interpretation of land and its value always has been along racially unjust lines. And whether people are isolated in rural communities, whether the under-resourcing of urban communities, whether it's because of our Blackness, our people of colorness, indigenous people who have always cherished and stewarded the land, we were not in positions to be equitable participants in the decision-making around protection and saving the land and nurturing the land for future generations. So I'm so pleased at the advocacy of Eugene at Springfield chapter to know that we're in the room with those who are about good purpose. And my tagline is to always, as the late Representative John Lewis said, be about good and necessary trouble for the benefit of all of us. Whatever we can do, however we can spread the word and continue to move our state to recognize, to affirm, as you said, to affirm, to recognize, and to ensure that all of us are represented, rural, isolated, urban, disenfranchised, poor, marginalized, get to be at the table, the young folks who are on the front lines of environmental injustice and climate change so that we reap the benefit of Oregon laws and land use practices that honor us, that include us, that allow us to be more than inputters, but to be influencers and decision makers. I look forward to going forward with each of you and with all of you. And thank you for giving me the time to allow our Portland NAACP branch to be a part of this significant moment in turning the tide in Oregon. Thank you.
Beautifully spoken. Thank you so much, President Gary Smith. And Eric Richardson, the Executive Director of the NAACP Eugene Springfield chapter, is going to close it out for us. Thank you, Eric, and you're a wonderful partner.
All right. Thank you, Lisa. And thank you, Sharon, Senator Powers, Senator Manning. I'm very happy to be here and just in support of this great work. I'm just going to speak to some of the thoughts I had listening to everyone's talks today. Language and words matter. Our country is founded on such things. And as we move forward, it's going to be important that we be very intentional about the language and the words we use. And so this piece, both of these pieces of legislation speak to what Senator Powers mentioned, this generational change and the demographic change that is going on. And that if we really are going to have an inclusive government, if we're going to have trust, and we're going to have involvement, then it has to go both ways. And so that talks to the point that Dr. Bullard, I got to hear from him last night, and he talked about the invisible people, the invisible community. And we as a group, and with this piece of legislation, want to start to open up the door to all those people who have been made invisible. So we need to be, the invisibility needs to be removed through intentional policy and choices that we make as leaders going forward, so that these efforts speak to giving humanity and consideration and value to the most vulnerable people in our communities. So, and I also just want to thank Sharon for really talking about the intentionality. We're in a crisis. Dr. Bell once said, this is, we're not having issues. This is a actual catastrophe for the Black community and for communities of color. And that because for generations, we have been made invisible, and those things that are unsavory for the common community were put on our doorstep. And so now we just ask for consideration and going forward, leadership that has at its heart the caring of our people, the human component of why we have government, why we do the things we do, is to protect and nourish and sustain human life. So these things will go a long way to be intentional about that in the strategic and tedious work of government, of policy, land making rules. But what we have to do is have within those efforts and intentionality. So I really appreciate also the idea of moving away from the idea of minorities. Let's go forward as a state, in a nation, on a planet that is connected and that has many beautiful people and beautiful efforts afoot to help us all move forward. And so to move that idea of minorities and just talk about the historically disadvantaged people really goes a long way to really just giving people dignity and moving forward, and then looking at it with precise analysis what it is we're talking about when we talk about historically disadvantaged people. So thank you very much for coming here. There's much work to do. We have a lot of skilled and dedicated people working on this effort, and there are other efforts that are aligned with this effort will inform. And so let's do this together. And I thank you all for being a part of this. And Lisa, I appreciate your long-term reaching out and understanding the importance of bringing all voices into this conversation around environment and justice and people's lived experience. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. My name's Danny. I'm the Climate Policy and Legislative Affairs Manager at Beyond Toxics, and I'm just going to jump in because we're at the end of our formal speakers, and Lisa has a train going by the office. With anyone familiar with Eugene knows the 4th Avenue train that goes by every once in a while. But we are at the Q&A session. Right before we get started with that, I did want to just alert everyone who's joined this press conference to a really exciting event tonight that's being hosted by Lane Community College. They are bringing Dr. Robert Boller from Texas Southern University, also known as the father of environmental justice. They are bringing him to a virtual Zoom event this evening to celebrate the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So it's really great timing with the launch of this legislative campaign to also hear from the man who in many ways is responsible for this movement getting started way back in the 70s with some of his groundbreaking research, and we're really just carrying the torch. So I've heard him speak before. He's a fantastic lecturer, fantastic speaker, really encourage people to join that. But as we are at the Q&A session, I just wanted to sort of talk about the process for that on Zoom. So I'll be taking questions from members of the press. You can do that either by messaging me directly. As you can see, my name in Zoom is Q&A Danny Noonan, or you can use the raise hand function in Zoom as well, which is I think at the moment is listed under reactions. So there's a raise hand button. We'll have this go for about 10-15 minutes, after which we'll wrap things up. And if you could just identify yourself as well, your affiliation, who you're with, when you put questions as well. So I'm seeing a question from Cassandra, who I believe is with OPB. And the question is, can anyone share an example of what kinds of land use decisions might change if Oregon were to update its land use goals to address environmental justice and climate change? And that's a fantastic question. And probably the best way to explain it, particularly on the environmental justice side, is currently goal 1 of the statewide land use planning goals covers what's called citizen participation, which itself is a bit of an outdated term. It really should be public participation. But that there's 2 issues with that goal as it currently exists. One of which is that it only concerns or only requires notice to landowners within a certain radius. I think it's 300 feet of land use decisions. And there's 2 problems with that. One is we're talking about landowners when those decisions are made, which excludes renters and the general community in that area. Then the other issue is that's just the sort of immediate impacts of that land use decision. It doesn't, there's no requirement to bring communities that may experience downstream impacts from that decision into the land use decision-making process there. So that's one example that the proposed goal amendments to address environmental justice would address, would capture, and how it would look differently to how it currently does. And then on the climate change side, what we envision is goal amendments that would require future land use decisions to be consistent with state goals for climate mitigation, for climate adaptation, for climate sequestration. So if there is a land use decision or a comprehensive plan that's going to make it more difficult for certain communities to adapt to climate change, or is going to take us further away from our state and federal goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, then that planning decision may be inconsistent with those goals. I'm just trying, okay, got another question here from Emily Green at Street Roots. What are some examples of how the joint resolution to affirm values will be put into practice? That's a fantastic question. And I think the short answer is really it's to be determined. I mean, I think we all understand that achieving environmental justice in Oregon, or even properly redressing environmental injustice, is not something that's going to be achieved in a single legislative session, no matter how many bills you introduce. But this is a process that is going to take time, and there is a need to do it right. So what the joint resolution does is it establishes a framework and a set of sort of shared principles and values for the state to guide future legislation, future bills, which will cover a whole host of issues, including the climate crisis, but also including things like pollution, local direct pollution in communities. But what this resolution says is we need to know where we're going, and we need to know why we're doing this before we get started. So that's essentially the function of that joint resolution.
Yeah, and I'd agree. I think the resolution is a big part about intentionality, and it shows the intentionality of moving forward deliberately with equity at the forefront. We can't go backward. I think that we're, the pandemic, racial tensions, which are continuing to grow, and people's imagination around that is beginning to be woken up. But we need to bring people together, and we understand that there's opposition. And so through resolutions, we try to slowly build understanding, partnerships, relational alignment between those efforts within ECJ, and as they happen in other sectors of our government. So I think this is just a good way of us taking a step forward with intentionality.
Thank you, Eric. And I did also just want to draw attention to a comment that was made to me in the chat by Jonathan Harker at the Oregon Association of American Planners, relating to Cassandra's question from OPB about how the changes to the planning goals would look differently to how they do today. So he says that an example of the climate amendments would be that a decision about whether or not to expand an urban growth boundary would need to consider and address the effect that expanding that urban growth boundary would have on climate change and on emissions, and that there's no such criteria that's applied to those kinds of decisions today. I have another question come in, still very much encouraging questions from press, but I feel I'll take a question from Paul Edison Lamb at NAACP Portland, asking what is the statutory language that would replace the term minorities? The language in House Bill 2488 that would replace the term minorities as exists in some planning statutes in Oregon currently talks about communities, talks about disadvantaged communities, but the term that we've used specifically replacing minorities is persons of color, which may include individuals who identify as, and then there's a whole list, but it includes Black or African American, Hispanic or Latino, Asian or Asian American, Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, American Indian or Alaska Native, Arabic or North African, Middle Eastern, mixed race, mixed ethnicity, or another ethnicity or race that historically or currently experiences health, economic, and sociological disparities. So that's the comprehensive answer there. But the idea is sort of moving away from this somewhat sort of pejorative language that's associated with the minority identifier and recognizing the demographic shifts that are occurring in Oregon. Any other questions? I think just to wrap things up, two things that might just be worth pointing attention to, particularly with House Bill 2488, is one of which is funding, as is often the question, and we are entering into a pretty difficult funding environment in this legislative session, you know, as a result of the impacts from COVID and the wildfires and a number of other sort of issues that we've been dealing with in the last year. But we are very glad to announce that Governor Brown's proposed budget for this year includes $800,000 to the Department of Land Conservation and Development to begin the sort of process of scoping amendments and changes to the statewide land use planning goals. And so the purpose of this bill we see is really to sort of focus and direct those efforts towards a change at the end of the day that provides results for the communities that are really suffering in this state. So that's timing. And then I think, or sorry, rather that's funding. And then I think the other thing just to point out about the bill is timing. You know, we know that a process of amending statewide land use planning goals that have been in place for 50 years and have really shaped the sort of geography of this state is one that's going to take some time. And the bill recognizes that and recognizes this will be a multi-year process at the end of the day. But as Amy mentioned right at the beginning, one of the things that the bill proposes to do is to, in the near future, have a rulemaking to establish interim standards that will sort of serve as a backstop for these issues in the meantime, and will be based on reports and recommendations by Oregon state agencies that can be pulled off the shelf and implemented into our land use planning system. I'm not seeing any more questions, so I would just like to thank everyone who's attended. I'll pass it back to Lisa to wrap up. But if there are any questions, our contact information on the website, happy to answer anything over email, or make any of our amazing staff and team available for interviews as appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Danny. And I just wanted to one last time hand it back to Amy, who wants to make a closing comment, and then I'll wrap it up.
Thank you, Lisa. In the beginning, I neglected to mention that I was a student at the University of Oregon. And in one of my lessons, I heard this quote from Hop Hopkins. He's the director of organizational transformation for the Sierra Club. And he said, "You can't have climate change without sacrifice zones. And you can't have sacrifice zones without disposable people. And you can't have disposable people without racism." Meaning, if we didn't see people as disposable, we wouldn't destroy their homes, their water, their soil in order to extract natural gas or bury or burn garbage or smelt metal or manufacture cheap disposable goods that we don't really need. So this is really just I'm just restating the values that are underpinning these two pieces of legislation. We're calling out racism, we're calling out white supremacy, and its good friend, extractive capitalism. And just keep that in mind as we go forward. Thank you.
Well, I think there's not much more to add to the wonderful comments and information shared here today. Thank you again, Senator Manning, Representative Power, Sharon Gary Smith, President of the NAACP Portland, and Eric Richardson, Executive Director of the NAACP Portland, and the wonderful Beyond Toxic staff who have created this environment for us to chat and have been managing behind the scenes, and Danny for answering questions as our Climate Policy and Legislative Affairs Manager. Don't forget that tonight you can hear the father of environmental justice, Dr. Robert Boller, speak, courtesy of Lane Community College in honor of Martin Luther King celebration days. And that's by Zoom, and it's free. And Anna put in the chat how you can get a free registration for that. So thank you all for joining us today. And as Danny said, we're here for you anytime. And we hope that you'll support this legislation. It's visionary, and we're in it to win it. Thank you.